So let's talk about how we can do the addition and subtraction of angles, because we're not always going to have those nice perfect 30, 45, 60 angles that we are so used to working with. And for this, we actually have formulas that we can use, which are here on the side. So if you had two different angles and you notice that you could subtract or add our nice angles, then you can use them at your advantage and use them to apply. In the example for cosine pi over 12, we notice that it's actually in radians instead of degrees. So one way that we can do this is by looking at our angles in radian form. So we remember that 30 degrees is pi over 6, 45 degrees is pi over 4, 60 degrees is pi over 3, 90 degrees is pi over 2, and 180 degrees is pi. But our angle that we're looking at has a denominator of 12. So let's make them all have a denominator of 12. That way it can be a little easier for us to see. So pi over 6 is the same as 2 pi over 12, and that's just by multiplying by 2 in the numerator and denominator. Pi over 4 is the same thing as 3 pi over 12. 3 pi over 3 is the same as 4 pi over 12. That's by multiplying 4 in the numerator and denominator. And pi over 2 is the same as saying 6 pi over 12 by multiplying 6 to both numerator and denominator. And pi is the same thing as saying 12 pi over 12. And that's just by multiplying 12 to numerator and denominator. Okay, so looking at this, we know that we want our angle to be pi over 12. And if we look at our angles, we can notice that 3 pi over 12 and if we subtract 3 pi over 12 minus 2 pi over 12, that is pi over 12. You can also do the same thing with 4 pi over 12 and 3 pi over 12. But just for convenience, I'm going to use 3 pi over 12 and 2 pi over 12. So cosine of pi over 12 is the same thing as saying, so we're going to actually take the original angle. 3 pi over 12 is the same thing as 4 pi over 12. Sorry, pi over 4. And that, we're going to subtract that by 2 pi over 12, which was originally pi over 6. So now we got our equivalent fraction. And now we can take our angles on the side here. So since we have cosine and we're subtracting, we're using this formula on the side. So in this case, our alpha is this first angle, so that's pi over 4. And our beta, that's b, our beta is pi over 6. So let's use this and plug everything in. So if we plug our alpha and beta into this formula here, then we're actually going to have that this is equal to cosine of our alpha, which is pi over 4, times cosine of pi over 6, plus sine of pi over 4 times sine of pi over 6. And now all we have to do is evaluate each of these. So you can either use the unit circle or the table that we used from last time. So by looking at the table, we can see that cosine of pi over 4 is the square root of 2 over 2 times cosine of pi over 6. Cosine of pi over 6 is the square root of 3 over 2 plus sine of pi over 4. That's again the square root of 2 over 2 times sine of pi over 6. That is times 1/2. So let's go ahead and multiply these. So we can multiply the square root of 2 times the square root of 3, which is the square root of 6, over 2 times 2, that's 4, plus the square root of 2 times 1, that's the square root of 2, and 2 times 2 is 4. Because remember that whenever we're multiplying fractions, all we have to do is multiply across. And since both of these have the same denominator, we can write them all over the same denominator. So this is just the square root of 6 plus the square root of 2 all over 4. So this is our final answer. If we look at tangent of 5 pi over 12, we can get 5 pi over 12 by adding 2 pi over 12 plus 3 pi over 12. So tangent of 5 pi over 12 is the same as taking tangent of 3 pi over 12 was pi over 4. So we're going to take pi over 4 plus 2 pi over 12 was pi over 6. So it is equivalent to saying this. And since we have addition now, we can use this formula over here. So we're going to be plugging everything into this formula. And we would get tangent of pi over 4 plus tangent of pi over 6 all over 1 minus tangent of pi over 4 times tangent of pi over 6. So now we can just evaluate each of these. Tangent of pi over 4 is 1, according to the table, or the unit circle, whichever you choose to use. Tangent of pi over 6, that's the square root of 3 over 3, all over 1 minus, as we said, tangent of pi over 4 is 1 times the square root of 3 over 3. So since we have our denominators as 3, a way to get rid of all the denominators would be by multiplying 3 to everything, because 3 would be the LCD. So if we multiply 3 to everything, it cancels out those denominators. So we don't have to worry about those anymore. So once we multiply, this is equal to 3, because 3 times 1 is 3, plus the square root of 3 all over 3 minus the square root of 3. And since we can't have a square root in the denominator, we're going to want to rationalize this by multiplying the conjugate. And remember, the conjugate is the same thing as the original, but we're going to switch the middle sign. So the conjugate of 3 minus the square root of 3 is just 3 plus the square root of 3. And we're going to multiply this to the numerator and denominator. So once we multiply everything out and simplify, we would get 12 plus 6 square root of 3 all over 6. And if we simplify this by dividing 6 to both terms, we would get 2 plus the square root of 3. So this is our final answer for tangent of 5 pi over 12. For cosine 11 pi over 12, one way of writing something that's equivalent to cosine of 11 pi over 12 would be by saying that 12 pi over 12 minus pi over 12, that's 11 pi over 12. So remember that 12 pi over 12, that's just pi. And we've actually worked with pi over 12 before, so that's something good that we can use. And this, since we're subtracting cosine, now we can use this formula for cosine and subtract to get our answer. So let's just fill everything in. So if we let alpha be pi and beta be pi over 12, we would get that this is cosine of pi times cosine of pi over 12 plus sine of pi times sine of pi over 12. So we can just go ahead and evaluate each of these. And cosine of pi, one way, if you guys don't remember what cosine of pi is, you can always use your calculator and plug it in. Just make sure that it's in radian form. So cosine of pi is also 1 and times cosine of pi over 12. We had previously evaluated this before in the previous example. So that was the square root of 6 plus the square root of 2 over 4. And then we're going to evaluate sine of pi. So sine of pi is actually 0. So because that's 0, we don't actually have to worry about this sine of pi over 12. Because whenever you multiply anything times 0, this whole thing is going to be 0. So that's going to cancel out. And so we're going to be left with negative square root of 6 plus the square root of 2 all over 4. So this is going to be our final answer. So make sure to subscribe to get the latest videos. Bye guys!